Mayer, the archivist at the Hudson Library and Historical Society. And for tonight's wonderful author series, we're joined by Jack Devine. Now, Jack has actually been to Hudson, Ohio, and he tells me he's very anxious to come back to Hudson, Ohio. So I think we all should encourage him in his pursuits of a third publication that is released after COVID so he can return to Hudson, Ohio. Welcome, Jack.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be back, and I can assure you it'll be after the virus passes. I'm really a slow writer. It takes me a couple of years just to get a book out. So, it'll be a little while, but I'll be back.
For those of you that don't know, Jack is the former Deputy Director of Operations at the Central Intelligence Agency, and he was Chief Afghan Task Force Director at the CIA. He is a noted author. His first book, which brought him to Hudson, Ohio, was Good Hunting. It was a memoir of his time at the CIA. This new book that he's written is Spymasters Prism. And speaking of books, libraries are all about books. I want you to be aware of the fact that both the library has this book and it's available for publication at the Hudson Library, or at the Learned Owl, excuse me. As always, you can submit your questions in the Q&A box or in the chat box or on Facebook in the chats, and we will relay your questions to Mr. Devine. So, Jack, you have this wonderful new book, Spymasters Prism. The first thing I'd like you to do is maybe explain the title.
Well, I spent a lot of time thinking about titles. Good Hunting took me 3 years to come up with, and it was the expression used among spies when they went out to do something. Spymasters Prism it's really about Russian intelligence operations against the United States over a long spectrum of time, from the beginning of the communist government, if you will, up until the Biden administration. I managed to get Joe Biden into the end of the book. So it's a look at their operations against us, and I view them as our number one threat from the intelligence perspective. And I called it Spymasters Prism because I think a spymaster is someone that runs spies, and senior spymasters run spymasters who run spymasters who run spymasters. And it's a way of looking at the world. And I have a chapter in there called Spymasters President, and we'll see if you can guess who that might be. So the book is about Russian operations. It's focused single-threadedly on that theme, and it's different than the other book. It's, as I said, it's a single theme. It's a current theme. I think it's today they sanctioned Russian officials because of Navalny. So it's a very topical subject, but I tried to give it historical roots and then do it through someone that's practiced the business for a long time and had direct dealings with the Russians over many, many years.
Jack, my first question to you is about resources. I read, I believe in your publication, that the CIA through the United States only devotes about 10% of our intelligence resources to Russian espionage. Is this a long-standing part of your budget? Or the budget, I should say. Has it always been 10%? Has it been greater? Has it been less?
Well, it certainly has been a lot more. It was in the Cold War, it was 70%. And my career, covered a large part of the Cold War, but it also covered the demise of the Soviet Union and, several years thereafter, almost a decade thereafter. So what I want to point out here when we're looking at dealing with the Russians, and we were all thrilled when the wall came down, and when I was in Moscow actually in June of 91, and the government fell in August of 91. There's a coincidence, by the way, that I was there in that time frame. But in those years, we were focused on the great threat that the Russians presented. But after the Cold War ended, we moved away from it. There was a period of Pax Americana, and both Republicans and Democrats said, well, cut the budget back. We don't need it. We get the Cold War benefit, if you will, dividend. And so the budgets dropped. And then on 9/11, the world changed again. It completely moved on its focus, on fulcrum, and it moved towards combating terrorism. And it came to our door in a big hurry, and the entire budget was shifted, or not the entire, but a very large amount went to dealing with terrorism. And that ended up also leading to 2 wars where American military were put on the ground in Afghanistan and Iraq. And when that happens, intelligence money follows that. And the intelligence money went to supporting those endeavors. So it was a long time, where the budget devoted towards Russia had been at a very depleted level of 10%. Now that's been moving for the past 2 years, but slowly. And at the same time, terrorism, it could come back on our doorstep with vengeance any day. But as an overarching theme of our national security, it's been on the decrease. So it has a tremendous impact, not just on budgets, but how people look at operations. And in Good Hunting, I noted, and this was in 2014, that I thought terrorism would in fact wane, and that we'd be back to nation states. And that's where we are today. Once in a while I get it right, Gwen. That was what I got right. So I think there's going to be a big readjustment, and at some point we should talk about the interplay between my view on this and China, but I leave that to you to drive the discussion that way.
Well, I want to tell people that you outline this book by 13 important lessons that you really think that we should absorb and practice in dealing with our relationship with Russia. And I thought some of these were fairly obvious. For instance, your very first one is that Russia is always going to be a bad player. I tend to think of him as a snake is always a snake.
Well, one of the subtitles of the book is Never Trust the Russians, right? Now, that is a quote from Ayub Khan, the first president in Afghanistan in 1905 to his son. And it says something like, whatever you do, my son, and you replace me, never trust the Russian, right? Now, that plaque was given to me by Charlie Wilson, the famous congressman who was involved in, it wasn't his war, we can talk about that too, but you're quite a character.
What I loved about your lessons, though, were that you used empirical, historical examples of why these are important to us and how they were examples of our relationship with Russia or the Soviet Union, depending upon the time. And throughout reading your book, I think I remembered or came across every spy that's ever done anything terrible to the United States and every other spy that's ever come from the Soviet Union and helped the United States. And literally I ran across Whittaker Chambers and the Rosenbergs and Kim Philby and Edward Snowden, and you did it in a historical timeline and brought it clear up to today.
So I think there's two things there, Gwen. That was exactly what I was trying to do, is tie the past to the present and to put markers down on the similarities and the consistency of the Russians in running their operations and how that impacted on this. Coming back to the obvious, there's a big debate about, what is Russia's role? How good or bad are they in terms of the United States? You're a very sophisticated follower of this, but many, many people wonder why we spend time on it. But I opened, if you recall, early in the book, there's a chapter that begins with Comrade Jay. Now, Comrade Jay was the deputy chief of what we used to call the KGB and now the SVR. And he came out in 2004. He worked several years before that with us. And what he said was, when I first joined the KGB, the number one target was the United States, the number two target was NATO, and the third target was China. And when I left in 2004, the number one target was the United States, the number two target was NATO, the number three target was China. So Russia's focus on America has been consistent, And it was only a very short period of time where the KGB was on its heels, but they still managed to handle Hansen during that time, so they weren't totally out of business. But slowly but surely, they've come back and are a very powerful and aggressive. And somewhere I want to talk about why that is such a problem today, as opposed to in the heyday of the Cold War.
Let's bring that up to 2016. To my knowledge, and I don't know everything by any shake of the stick, but in 2016, the Mueller report comes out, and it's the first time, to my knowledge, that a foreign government has been named in tampering with our presidential elections. And apparently, Mr. Brennan called over to Russia and said, hey, quit fooling around with our elections, and they just kind of blew him off.
Well, there's a couple of very important points that are embedded in your question. And there's a point that I think a lot of folks miss. The fact that people collect intelligence from a cyber platform is not a surprise. And it's not just the big powers, smaller powers. Today, it is an instrument of spying, whether you're big or small. So the collection of information is understood, right? And if you get caught, then you pay the penalties. What is unique about, and this is what I really want to underscore, and it gets to the heart of my issue with the Russia aggression, is it's not only that they penetrated the DNC, but they used it. They used it in Facebook, Twitter. In other words, they were meddling in the United States. And why that's important, when you watch too many movies, you see America's Russia messing around internally in Russia and them here. But that isn't really the true story. We had an understanding with the Russians. It was called the Moscow Rules. And I don't want to confuse people, because there's two sets of Moscow rules. One which is bandied about by most CIA people and the media, and that is, what are the rules when you're operating in Moscow? You wear a T-shirt with the Mets on it, or the Yankees, and you speak English loud when you're having a clandestine meeting. Bad idea. So that's the Moscow rules. But the one that predates it really is a much more senior policy type of thing. We had an understanding. There's no written document. But the Russians and the intelligence business and the Americans did not meddle in each other's internal affairs. Now, there's a few exceptions to it. There was an incident when Reagan ran for president and the Russians meddled around. It was really minor. But, we frankly have not been meddling around internally inside Russia, since Stalin. And they haven't really been playing that game here. That has changed. That's the seismic change. It isn't that they got into the DNC and they put out the Facebook. It's the fact that they are now messing around internally in our system. That is the problem, and we do not have, as yet, as far as I can see, a proper response to it. At first, I thought this couldn't be because they're breaking the rules, and it's stupid. I mean, in my view, it is. That why would you want to create an unstable environment? And it really isn't they want it unstable. They just want us to be weak, and it's part of what I come back to my Spymaster president's view of the world, which I have great exception to, and that's Mr. Putin. So my point is, they meddled in the election, and that it was the use of the information, not the acquisition. It was really the camel that broke the back, as far as I was concerned about what they were up to.
Could you speak a little bit about Mr. Putin and his background and his thought processes?
Well, I think he's a key to so much of modern life as it deals with Russia. I mean, it's called the Spymasters Prism, a chapter lesson, right? And underneath it says, there is no such thing as a former KGB officer, says Vladimir Putin. That's a quote from him, right? And I would say the same thing. There's no such thing as a former CIA officer. And what he means is, what I would mean is, there's a way of looking at the world. And so he's looking at the world by his definition as a KGB officer. And you have to know his background, that he wanted to join the KGB at 17. He ended up eventually getting in a little bit later. But the Russians I dealt with were in many of the capitals of the world. They were sophisticated. They drank the best wine and enjoyed the benefits of the free world. Putin was assigned to Dresden during the Cold War. That's about as dark as you can get. And this very famous head of the East German intelligence service, Marcus Wolf, who's sort of the center figure in Le Carré's book, Carla. But it was a dark. He had 100,000 spies. I mean, who has 100,000 spies? But it was dark. So when the Soviet Union collapsed in 91, for him, it was the end of the world as he knew it. That the institution he loved, the country he loved, fell apart. And he was adamant in his own formation that he was not going to let that happen to whatever degree he could influence the situation. I don't think he anticipated that he would be president, but his skills as a KGB officer and the manipulation and the types of things that one does in assessing people made him a very effective political figure, first in St. Petersburg, and then he received a position on Yeltsin's staff. And all the big boys at that time thought, well, Putin is somebody that's a company guy and we can handle him. And of course, it turned out the other way around. So I'm impressed as a very young man, a short lead time between relatively leaving the KGB and becoming the president of Russia, how quickly and young he was and how effective in a very difficult system. I think it highlighted for me that you need to watch this guy very carefully because he has great capabilities. And he has shown, I think, great tactical skill and pushing power out. The problem I have, and if you were to hire me as an advisor and if it was legal, I would say, listen, Vladimir, you're handling your tactical part great, but your strategy is terrible. In other words, you're working towards a confrontation with the West when Russia ought to be part of the West. We ought to be in commerce together and culturally together, and you really would be better off if you weren't so aggressive in your relationship with the West. But from his mind, he sees us in the same context as the Cold War. And if we miss that point and think that he's a smiling face and we're going to persuade him to change his way, I think we're missing the point. And the only thing he does really seem to understand is power. So, I would like to see a reset with Russia, but it takes two to tango, and I don't see him taking any dancing lessons, to be honest. So he is the one behind. In other words, we shouldn't get confused that this was a one-off. I thought it was a one-off when they first did what they did in the 2016 election. But the more I looked at it, I realized it is part of their strategy. And if one looks at it, they now have what they call a hybrid strategy where they use propaganda and cyber as part of a constant struggle with the West. And that's what this is, undermining the U.S. so that it's weaker, not to have a revolution, but just a weaker country. And frankly, I think he overachieved. He didn't realize how debilitating his intervention in the 2016 election was going to make America politically. I think the outcome of that far exceeded whatever he thought he would collect from an intelligence point of view. It led to more dissent and cultural divide inside the United States. So his meddling paid off in the context of his objective. I just think his objective is wrong-footed.
Jack, some would say that we have a fractured approach. For instance, there's the Department of State, there's the FBI, there's the CIA, there's the National Security Agency. If we're going to combat cyber terrorism and espionage, should we not have a more cohesive team, all operating on the same page, all with the same message?
Yeah.
Well, I think in an overarching way, we should have, and I think we do. Let me be clear. There's different roles. The FBI's primary function is internally in the United States, and that's the way it should be. With terrorism, they've branched out abroad, and I can understand that, but its primary mission is in the United States and to the defense of our country and the criminality of organized crime and things like that. The CIA's mission is not in the United States. It is abroad, and it should be clearly And it is clearly delineated. So it has a different mission and has since its beginning. NSA is a special category because it deals with signal intelligence, the art of collecting signals from all the different ways that one can. The important thing is they should be separate. You shouldn't be mixing and matching these things, but you have to integrate them at a certain level. So you have to have cooperation among those agencies. And I think in the last 25, 30 years, there's been greater cooperation among the agencies and sharing of information. I am not an advocate, and I'm on the record. I think I was in the Washington Post the day they created the National Directorate of Intelligence, right? And they were going to bring all the agencies together. And I said, look, you're just creating more bureaucracies. And DHS, I wasn't comfortable with that either. So I think we created a lot of bureaucracies on the deck of a ship, and we really haven't done much to improve our effectiveness through that. I'm actually for a much smaller, leaner, focused effort in the intelligence world. I think the head of the DNI at one point said he had 100,000 analysts. Well, he didn't have them. They weren't really his, but to have 100,000 analysts, an awful lot of people working on. I'm trying to think of what do they do, 100,000 people. But so I think there's need for reform, but nobody wants to get into the reform business. And why? It's a thankless job. You do not get rewarded. You don't get promoted. It's only a headache. So sometimes they push through reforms. They usually come from Congress. And as I said earlier, every time it comes up, I'm a dissenting voice. I've seen no improvement from the reforms, the organizational reforms coming out of Congress.
But with cyber threats, is there one agency that's tasked with handling those as above others?
Well, you have a cyber command now in the military, which is one aspect of it. And then I think the other thing is NSA in terms of the ability to collect and monitor. Everybody has a cyber role, but the cyber field is really interesting, not so much about how we coordinate, because I think it's better than generally perceived, but how do we respond in this day? What are the rules of the road? If we have, for example, nuclear weapons, we end up with treaties. How do you end up with a real treaty on cyber? And this is a genuine problem today. There are no rules of the road. Russia's meddling in the United States, and the question is it on the books or not on the books? This is the way we're going to play the game. So we are in an undefined period in the cyber world, and I'm worried more about that problem. I'm fairly satisfied with the coordination among our agencies. I just think there's too many agencies playing in the same pond.
Okay, I'll grant you all of that. Let's talk a little bit about beyond. I hate to go beyond Russia, but in some ways, Russia gets its fingers in everything, it seems like. What do you have to say about Russia and China?
Well, I'm glad you raised the question, because I think a lot of people have a knee-jerk reaction to my comments, and that is, oh, China's a threat. Everybody knows China's the threat today. That's the threat, right? And so I think there's a distinction between what I'm writing in the book and when we're looking at China. At one point I was writing about all the government agencies, and I finally figured that was going to be too big. That's going to be a 4-volume book. But when you look at China, China is the geopolitical economic threat for the next half a century, right? In other words, that's where the powers being congregated. And it is the number one threat in that context. But not from an intelligence point of view, and not about interfering as aggressively as the Russians. The Russians are really the ones that are pushing the envelope inside the United States and in our face. The Chinese are trying to balance it out because of the trade economic relationships. They put self-restraint, if you will, if that's the right word. So they are a bigger, longer term threat. But if you look at their operations in the United States, sure, they're collecting things in cyber. And, periodically you'll catch a hack, but not of the nature of going into the State Department, Treasury Department. And I believe we're only looking at the tip of the iceberg. And the Chinese strategy isn't to destabilize, I shouldn't use the word stabilize, to weaken us, because they want us strong, not necessarily in the military arena, but they want us strong economically so that that we have commerce together. So I think there's a difference between looking at China in the geopolitical military side and looking at Russia from an intelligence side and what they're actually doing in our political process. And I think that's the difference. And I'm putting the priority on the intelligence of the Spymaster's Prism. I'm looking at it from the Spymaster's view of where is the action that's threatening the United States internally, and I'd say it's Russia.
But Russia acts with other countries, and unfortunately, the United States, somehow because of our treaties and our belief systems and our values, we sort of get in the mix of things. And a prime example would be Venezuela and Maduro, or Syria. Do you think these are deliberate, backhanded assaults on the United States?
I think it's part of the strategy I was talking about before. It's the Cold War strategy. I mean, how is that different? I mean, they went into the Crimea. They went into the Ukraine. Russia's a relatively small country economically without Ukraine. So the Ukraine brings them the breadbasket and the industrial support that makes it a more powerful country as a country. What was the Cold War strategy? You know, Ukraine had to be part of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev lost his job over that issue. And then you look at the border states around Russia. It was to weaken them, right? It was to have warm water ports, and that goes back to the Tsar. So getting into the Crimea, getting into Syria, getting a port, and pushing back at every opportunity where U.S. interests lie. They're meddling in Iran, right? They're trying to block us there. The relationship with China is designed to try and neutralize us, although the Chinese and the Russians will always have a very careful eye on each other and the terms of a long-lasting relationship. Messing around in Latin America, let's not forget the Bay of Pigs, right? But now when you get to, or Chile, when I was there as a young man, the Russians were hoping that would be the first bastion or first spot on the continent where the Communist Party could come to power through the ballot box. They never tried it after Chile. Venezuela is it's so much a reflection of my days in Chile under Allende and Maduro, and how he has turned that country into a terrible, depressive place. And the Russians are supporting him. There's no question that they were in there. They were lending money at a critical time. Are they in full force? No. But if you're looking at it, it's a coherent whole. It is Cold War III. This is how you fight the Cold War against America. I'm saying, Putin, please, you don't have an ideology. We're not in the same battle anymore. Let's cut a deal. Why don't you join the West? But he's hung up. But he's good at what he's doing, and he causes a lot of trouble.
Well, speaking of good at what he's doing, do you believe that they had a hand in January 6th?
On January 6th, what are you thinking of?
The attempted, I'm not sure what, at the federal Capitol, at the Congress.
Oh, sorry. No, I don't think so. What I'm saying is not that they're trying to create a revolution. They don't want a revolution in the United States. Now, what they want are people and groups to be arguing and fighting in the United States among themselves and keeping their democratic process weak. But they're not looking to create a revolution in the United States. That you can spot. I mean, I know how that's done, and it's a lot bigger investment, and the ground has to be right. This country is not ready for that. So I really, if they are, it's dabbling. They are. I would not put that burden on the Russians. I mean, I like to, but it really doesn't apply, I think, from my perspective.
Now, the question of the year. How has the pandemic / COVID affected Russia? Well,
again, I don't put any responsibility. I put responsibility to China for the way they handled it vis-a-vis the rest of the world. I think many countries were very aggressive from an intelligence point of view, and I have no reason to believe that we were. And that was they were looking for collecting scientific data that would enable them to get a leg up on getting their own vaccine. So I think they were very aggressive. I also think with little doubt that the very early statistics coming out of Russia were badly manipulated and underestimating the threat. And I think they did have a serious problem, and they covered it up, as did many countries covered it up. But I don't see them as the bad boy in the pandemic. I think that's the China problem.
I was interested to learn in your book about George H.W. Bush and his giving the Gorbachev regime a heads up, actually 3 heads up, that there might be an attempted coup, which sort of speaks to the fact that at times we have tried to consider Russia our friend. Would you like to elaborate there a little?
Yeah, I knew George Bush Sr. Not very well. I was mid-level officer, knew him better later, but a first-class person. That's the first thing I would say about him. But when you look back, I think he's going to continue to rise in the rankings of presidents. You know, I think we give a lot of credit to President Reagan for, defining the seriousness of the Cold War. We were going to have it out, and it ended on good terms as far as we're concerned. But the Soviet Union didn't collapse under Reagan; it collapsed under Bush. Managing that, George Bush had a great team of advisors, and we've seen, and I'm not going to name names, a lot of presidents have come in with weak advisors, and their administrations have suffered because of it. But he had a very strong team that managed. Remember, the Iraq War, the first Iraq War, with Colin Powell, and they had great restraint there. They didn't go into Baghdad. Why? Because they knew if they got in there, we owned it, and that was so. There was great measured moves and statesmanship by George H. Bush, and I think he deserves that. Notifying Gorbachev, I'm sure there was a hotly contested meetings, but in the 70s we were operating. CIA itself was operating. Any reporting we had about a threat, a terrorist threat, an assassination against our enemies, we were obligated to report it. I mean, most people would find that to be crazy, but it was a reality of how we viewed our responsibilities. And I think George Bush and his team was looking at this situation saying, if Gorbachev goes, God knows what comes behind it. And I was in Moscow, as I told you, in June. I was supposed to meet the head of the KGB. Instead, I ended up with the deputy. And I wasn't insulted. I thought, well, I'm just the head of counter-narcotics. Why not? What I didn't know at that time was that the head of the KGB was organizing the plot that George Bush was warning about. So George Bush was trying to prevent, in my view, an undetermined, perhaps very far-right element, if you will, a resurgence of the communist regime in Russia. So it was for our preservation, but I also think he felt as a statesman the obligation to advise another head of state of the risk. So I think he gets high marks on that, and it was to Gorbachev's unfortunate that he did not listen to it, because our intelligence was spot on.
Donnie asks, what advice would you give President Biden about Mr. Putin?
Well, I think I would say this, that we're going to try and create. You can see the markings. Every president decides he's going to have a new relationship with the Russians. Go back to Jack Kennedy and his first meeting with Khrushchev, which I go into. Jack learned quickly thereafter how to make an adjustment. By the time the missile crisis came, we almost went to war with them. So I would be cautious to say, Mr. President, you need to understand that he's working off of a Cold War playbook, and the only thing he's going to understand is serious realism on our side. If we're going to start jawboning with him and think we're going to be convincing him through charm and wit, you're really underestimating this guy. When he went to Helsinki, I promise you, he had really tough talking points that he was going to work his agenda. He wasn't worried about charming people. So I think dealing with the Russians, and I would say put at the very top of my list, what are the ground rules that we're going to operate on cyber? Are you going to continue deliberately undermining the American political system. And if you can't come up with an agreement, why don't we have our two intelligence chiefs meet and talk it out through? But if not, then I'm telling you right now, if you continue, I'm going to respond. And I think that, that's tough talk, but I actually believe that that's what's said. And frankly, we sometimes as Americans underestimate the value of tough talk. We like to work it out, charm people. In the private sector, I learned sometimes there's a lot to be said for walking away from the table if you mean it.
There's a question about a 2016 effort, a Russian effort to dissuade blacks from voting, and a female by the name of Clarissa. Do you know anything about this?
No, I'm sorry. I can't comment. It's not something that was on my, share with me at some point what you've read, and maybe I can read the tea leaves.
Okay, let me see what else we have from the audience.
I know you're going to have Bob Gates, so I just want to say one thing about Bobby. First of all, it'll be a treat for everybody, given the breadth of experience.
Well, wait, Jack, let me bring the audience up to speed. I believe it's on March, it might be March 15th, but I know it's in that third week of March. We are hosting Robert Gates, the former Secretary of Defense, and he used to be a former director of the CIA, I believe in the early 90s. Am I right?
No, I think it was, well, I don't want to speculate now. I think he was the deputy in the 80s. So it probably was in the early, it was under Bush.
And Mr. Gates will be speaking about his new book, Exercise of Power. So now now that we've got that out of the way.
Well, Bob also spent time at the White House, a lot of serious time. I mean, that's where I think you're going to get your greatest bang for the buck here at the library, and that is his understanding of how policy is made, and then his time at the Defense Department and how that relates to the military arm. So he's had, an extraordinary span of experience. But in the book, I quote him because I was fairly junior. I think it was a head of a division, maybe Latin American division or counter narcotics, and he was either the director or deputy director, but somehow he got seated across me at this dinner. It was an in-house dinner upstairs in the dining room. And this must have been, you're right about the timing, because this was after the Russian collapse. So it was in 91, 92. And we were sitting there saying, well, how long do you think it's going to last now that the government has fallen? How long are we going to have a democratic government? And I don't know if we'll remember this discussion, but we had a collective view that somewhere between 3 and 5 years, the KGB would be back in business. So we were off by several years. It took a little longer, but not too much longer. But I think there was, and Bob's a Russian expert. His roots are in Russia, and I think when you're talking to Bob, he'll have a good understanding of Russia. I don't know if we'll agree, but nothing's wrong with that. But we both felt that the system, the Russian system, it was so hard to go from the czar system to the communist system to a democratic system that they had an uphill battle. And I think we were all rooting for it. I think we should have done more collectively to bring Russia into the West. And I think we missed some opportunities, but we both were pessimistic about the path to democracy. And I don't know if he remembers that, but I do.
Nick asks me to bother you a little bit about sanctions. And certainly today is the day to talk about it with the United States and its sanctions with the European Union in regards to Navalny and the Russians. But he wants to know about the effectiveness and the effects of sanctions against Russia. Are they an effective tool?
I think they are. I mean, I'll go back 25 years. There was a prevailing view in Washington, not a prevailing view. There was a split view. Sanctions aren't worth it, right? But I actually believe sanctions are very effective economically, and countries have to deal with it. But there's a whole range of sanctions, and you can keep cranking them up. You can destroy someone's economy, right? So you're trying to measure. And I'll leave it to the experts. But I believe in sanctions. I also believe that you have to be strong. When Putin went into the Crimea, I think our response was underwhelming. In other words, we did not provide the Ukrainians with military equipment or take a strong position. I think that was a mistake, and I think he was probably more aggressive than he might have originally planned. So I think you have to have sanctions, and I think I'm very pleased that the government is responding to Navalny. I mean, we're part of a world society. You're going to let assassinations take place and attempted assassinations to continue? Again, there has to be an understanding of how are we going to play this game, Vladimir? And I think we have to respond, and I think it has to be a stronger response. I said, I really am rooting for a reset here, but it takes two to tango, as I said, and I don't see it on his part just yet. So I think we're going to have to be very tough. We cannot allow him to continue what he's doing, messing around inside our internal political affairs. It's unacceptable.
There's a question about the end game for Russia and Syria.
Well, the end game is, as I said, go back to the old school books about Russia, that he has a foothold in the Middle East, and a base in the Middle East is a major accomplishment. So he's going to play that game. He's going to stay in that game. He's not going to abandon that. We had this view that Assad was only going to be in 6 months. I mean, here we are years later, right? So he's in there tough. He's protecting his equities. So we think he's going to leave anytime in a hurry. We better go look at his playbook again. And it says, that's not what I want to do. I am going to move every place I can to enhance Russia's prestige and power in the world. He's working off a small base, though. He doesn't have the same power base that the Soviet Union had. He's a smaller player.
Someone wants to know what we've learned from dealing with Russia in World War II. And I would ask you to sort of address the whole Yalta conference, Alger Hiss topic as well.
Russia was our ally in World War II. They paid a hell of a price in World War II for resisting the Nazis. I mean, forgetting communism for a minute, just what the Russian people went through. I think there's tens of millions. I mean, over 10 million people were lost in that confrontation. The battles for Stalingrad, I mean, they're mesmerizing when you read the hardship and what they went through. They're a tough people, the Russians, and they are very strong nationalists. We've got to remember that. They really believe in Mother Russia, and that should be respected. So there was a huge price to pay. But Stalin had his game plan. He knew what he was going to do when he went to Yalta. Unfortunately, and I go into this book, in the book, and this is where really valuable spies placed at the right location can make a difference on history. And for those who don't know, Alger Hiss was a senior State Department fellow who was in Yalta with Roosevelt. And Churchill once said that Stalin had our plans before we did. In other words, when they were working up the plans, they were already in Stalin's hands before Roosevelt and Churchill got them. And I think a lot of people felt that, Eastern Europe, we lost Eastern Europe in Yalta, and that part of that was due to good spying on the part of the Russians, and Alger Hiss was part of it. And, why it was controversial for many years whether Hiss was or wasn't, the Verona tapes and everything pretty well make it clear, and I don't think that's disputed. But Stalin also developed and obtained the early information we had in the Manhattan Project to build a nuclear bomb. In other words, his intelligence network in the United States gave him the ability to close the gap on developing a nuclear weapon. And I'm saying to you, Putin is up from that pedigree, and he understands the importance of collecting intelligence so that he knows what the Americans are going to do ahead of time. And he also knows the value of penetrating our defense infrastructure to get the technology that we have so he can apply it to his own military hardware. And I'm convinced of that.
Sandy sort of touches on this with her question. she wants to know, is our conception of Russians, literally Russian spies living next door to us, literally true? And approximately, we know that you don't know everything, Jack, but approximately how many spies...
Is that in dispute? I hope it's not in dispute. My wife is here. She's ready to tell you right now that I am often wrong several times a day.
How many Russian spies at any one given time in a modern day do you think are in the United States?
Well, let me start with your first question, because the last one is an unknowable. Let me leave unknowable away for a second. I go into the book. First of all, the American show, I love the show. I'm not promoting it. They don't pay me anything. But it actually has a great deal of tradecraft about how what we call unofficial officers work in other countries. In other words, you're not a Russian, you're not carrying Russian documentation. And we have the same thing around the world, trust me. It's not a secret. So, there's people like me that worked in we're known to be an American and in an American installation embassies. But there are Americans out there who are in harm's way because they have no protection, but they fly under another flag. So the Americans talk about this group in New Jersey, or about a couple that run all operations. The only thing I want to put to rest, they're not out there bumping off the vice president and all the wild things that they do. But the fact that there are people embedded in the United States is a very true story. And there was a wrap up, I think 2012, if my numbers are right, of a group in Jersey. Several of them, including a woman named Chapman, who was very attractive and actually ended up dating Putin, apparently, at least the rumor is. So they were wrapped up. They were living as Americans in suburbia, carrying out operations. And I also go in the book early on about Abel. And Abel was a spy in New York in the 40s. And they have the movie with Tom Hanks where they trade him on the bridge in Germany for some of our spies. So the fact that there are people embedded, your neighbor, not to make everybody nervous, could actually be a spy. Now, one of the things that they were going to do and didn't do, thank God, was they were going to bring small nuclear weapons and place them around the United States clandestinely, so that if the big end came, they would be able to detonate them. And that never happened, but it was part of the planning. So they needed infrastructure in the United States. The FBI, I think, does a very good job of tracking Russians and Russian operations and the CIA together. I don't think there was a sense when I was there today that there's so many people embedded in the system that are real Russians. I think it's if there were 100, I wouldn't be surprised. If there were much more, I would be surprised. The bigger question for me is how many Americans are spying for the Russians in key positions in the United States? And, what's the ballpark figure? I don't know. My experience would tell me maybe they have 20, maybe they have 30, maybe we have 20, maybe we have 30. There's not hundreds. But one like Alger Hitz or Rick Ames or Hansen can be devastating to your intelligence structure. And we can talk about those folks as the will of your audience.
Jack, I'm not a young chicken anymore.
Well, it depends if you're sitting where I am.
And I'm going to break it to you, but you got a little gray hair. And you are retired.
Yeah, but this is a disguise. I'm not retired. Please do not tell anybody I'm retired. I got a note from a kid, not a kid, what am I talking about? A classmate of mine from high school said, Jack, you wrote a book. It's so great that a guy is retired and he has the time to write a book. Listen, I'm running a business. I run a business. It's a full-time business. It's an enterprise. And the book is an advocation, something I want to do. So I'm not retired. I left the agency. My heart didn't leave the agency, and that's what Putin said. And real CIA operators cannot get it out of your blood system. You identify with it, you defend it, because you, like me, so many of us join because of a mission, and that mission never goes away, which is to defend this country. And there are a lot of young people today that are carrying out that mission.
let's talk about those younger people. How do you recruit them for espionage? And are we doing it properly? Are we still getting the cream of the crop? Are they still joining with passion and vigor and intelligence and drive and patriotism? Talk to me about the recruitment of the next generation.
Yeah, recruitment implies a great effort on the part of the recruiter, right? And that may be when we're talking recruiting a spy, a foreigner to work for us, right? But a place like the CIA or the State Department, it's people that want to go there. They want to join. They identify with its mission. Public service is for different points in our history is undervalued. Public service is undervalued today, but still this is a big country. So the CIA, my rough estimate, because we can't talk about specific numbers, but my guess is every year there's 100,000 people that apply. Their career training, those people that are going to have expected to have command positions in the agency, ballpark figure, might be 100, tremendously competitive. So just getting through the computer process of selectivity, my guess would be they don't look much different over all the years are pretty much the same. There's the sense of mission there, and that's not scientific, but my own sense is when I've met young people and had the good fortune of meeting young people, or I often, when people come to see me, friends, families send people that have children that want to join the CIA, I'm always measuring the very first thing. It's not their language skill. They have a sense of mission, or is it a really cool place to go and then I'll spend 5 years. And if you don't have the sense of mission, you don't belong there because you're not going to make it. It's going to be so hard for you. So that mission part. So I think there's a lot of people. 9/11, 50-year-olds were volunteering to jump out of a helicopter. So it was a great rush, more than we could ever use. So I think the pool is there. There's something that it's hard to measure. And when I was inside, I probably only instinctively could feel it. And that is, are we getting the entrepreneurial mentality? And it's hard to test. What do I mean? And that is, are you a person that's going to take a case and run it very well? Good, that's a good thing. Or are you someone who's going to take the case and try and build it? And are you going to build this thing? So the building part is really very interesting. And I don't know. I don't know where we stand on that. My hope is that if you're attracting the same people and they have the same mission sense, that you probably have approximately the same number of creative people. I knew many of the people that founded the CIA, and they were all high energy people. They were amazing characters in so many ways, but they were tremendously creative. But in their hubris, they also made a lot of mistakes. But it's easier to it's easier to build a fire than bank a fire. So, if someone shows up with fire, we can figure out how to take some of the steam out of them if they're getting off the path. So I'm optimistic about that part. I should have one last thing, not to drag this on. You got to worry about the policymaker. CIA executes, and I believe, and I answered this question earlier today, CIA is quite capable of answering the challenges of any of the threats we face today. The question I have is, because of the division in our country and the lack of consensus, are our policymakers ready to provide the strategic guidance and advice and direction through the will of the Congress reflected from the people? Where are we on having that policy? Because I think that's a debilitating factor. If we do not have a consensus, when I did the Afghan program to drive the Russians out of Afghanistan, Republicans and Democrats couldn't do enough to push that program, a unified program. And you really shouldn't do covert action without it. So my point is, I'm not so worried about the CIA's ability to carry it out, or Defense Department, or State. I really think we're well set there. What is our policy? Do we have a leadership? Do we have a united nation around basic principles? I think we're coming up short there.
Jack, it's always a delight to talk to you. I'm so grateful that you chose to do this. I want you to hurry up and finish your next book so that after this pandemic, you can come back to Hudson and we can have more conversations, because there's such a wealth of knowledge and you're so willing to share and have that conversation with people that know next to nothing about all of this espionage, other than what we see Tom Cruise do on the movie screen now and again.
He makes it look so easy.
He does.
Well, the point is, you look at me, you know, we're not dealing with Tom Cruise here. Obama really looks like a spy, right? So that's.
We love you no matter what you look like.
This look helped me. If you look like Tom Cruise, you don't bring to the table the intimidation that a face like this as well brings. I'm a scary looking guy. I'm a really nice person in my mind anyway. But
yes,
scary.
You are.
So anyway, it's a pleasure. I'll be back in a couple of years, God willing.
Good luck and congratulations on the book. I have to say again, Spymasters Prism was a great read. I learned so much, and I would encourage you all to take time to read this book. I think it has some very salient things to speak to us about our relationship with Russia and the future. So thank you, Jack. Thank you for everybody participating. Remember, you can purchase the book at the Learn It Owl or get it at your local library. And I look forward to seeing some of you again when we speak to Robert Gates on March 15th. Thank you all. I wish you all a good night.
Thank you, Gwen.
Bye now.